Hello everyone and welcome to this fourth session of the 8th week of Angular development course. So far we have understood the various utilities which is provided by Angular in terms of components, directives, services, pipes, and now how can we use all this to create some basic applications, so on and so forth, right? So in this session we are going to predominantly focus on forms. Okay, as you guys already know, form is an HTML concept wherein it is nothing but a group of user interactable elements where the user can provide input, which could then be aggregated, validated, and then sent to the server for further processing. So anything that where you interact with the application in order to provide some data, it could be like your ticket booking website or food ordering app, whatever. So all of those are considered as forms. Okay, so first let's get into a basic introduction of forms. HTML form is nothing but it's used to collect user input and then it is sent to the server for further processing, as we discussed. A form may contain a bunch of different user input elements like text box, radio button, checkbox, date picker, etc. So anywhere where the user can give some input to the application, it's considered as a user input. Okay. So in Angular, basically we have two approaches on how to design and maintain any form in our application. So they are called as template driven forms and reactive forms. So first we'll go through the slides and then I will come to the whiteboard to explain you in detail. Okay. So we will understand what is template driven forms and reactive forms, which are the two approaches given by Angular to design any form. Okay. So for template driven form, we have something called as two-way data binding, which you guys already saw in terms of ng model. So if you guys remember what I said about ng model, whenever you tag ng model to a input tag and assign it a variable name, so whatever is the variable name that is given from TypeScript will automatically come on HTML. Similarly, if you update any value on HTML, that will automatically go back to the backend TypeScript model as well. So two-way data binding is used in template driven forms to update the component data model as the template changes and vice versa, as we discussed now. And directives are used in template driven forms to create and manipulate the underlying object model. Template driven forms are suitable under circumstances where you have extremely minimum form requirements and logic that can be maintained entirely in the template. And in template driven forms, the the form model is implicit rather than explicit. It is easier to create a template driven form where the form may not need to scale in future, and template driven forms delegate the creation of their form controls to directives and hence are asynchronous. Unit testing is generally a bit tough with template driven forms. And similarly for reactive forms, they give a more direct and precise access to underlying forms object model. The entire form control tree code is created in reactive forms and hence they are synchronous in nature, and as any value changes gets updated immediately passed to all children and siblings. It is best suited where scalability and unit testing is of prime importance or if the application is primarily form driven. So before we get into further discussion, let's get into whiteboard to understand it better. So in this session, we will not be looking into much code because we have an entire week next week which will be dedicated to template form, and after that we have an entire week which will be dedicated to reactive form. So in that courses we will be focusing more on the code part, but initially I want you to first understand what is the underlying concept of it. So we will be focusing more on the theory part and the underlying concept of it. Okay. So with that said, now let's first get into the concept of what is this template form all about and what is this reactive form all about. So before we go any further, I want you to assume, like, visualize the form. So if you see a form, what all it can have? So maybe it can have an input which could have like your name, it could have an input which could be a password, and like let's assume like we are designing a login page. Okay. So assume like I have a username, I have a password, I have like maybe a login button, and I have a button which says maybe forgot password or reset password. Okay. So if you see, most of the real world application login page is something like this. Okay. So wherein the user has some minimal inputs, and even in future if you see, this form has very limited liability or limited scope to grow further. So like it's barely possible that rarely there will be chance that except this user ID password there will be like 10 other fields added in future. It's highly impossible. So mostly what will happen is either one of these field may get removed or like you may have just one more extra field added. But apart from that, in your login page there isn't much scope to add like tons of different input forms in the future. Okay. So in those kind of scenarios, what we can do is, where the form is quite simple, we can directly use template driven forms. Okay. So what is template driven form is, if you just go back to our pipe discussion, right? So here, if you see, this is nothing but a simple template driven approach. Okay. So where what we are doing is, we have an input, though we have not wrapped it up in a form element and all, but just for high level understanding, this is good enough for you to understand. So basically what we are doing is, we have created an input. So if you come to the HTML, you will see that, we have created this input field, and this value that you see over here by default, this 10, is not coming from the HTML, but rather it is coming from the TypeScript file over here, right? And how that is coming is by use of this ng model. So to which we are adding this variable of fair degree. So what happens is, by default when the application starts, you will see this will initialize it to the number 10. So that is why you are seeing it as 10. But if I now change it from 10 to say 55, so what it does is, automatically from the view, it is also updating the model directly, and this value also gets updated since we have the pipe attached to it. So what I mean to say is, whenever you have such simple applications where you don't have much of form elements and too many validations and lot of complexities involved, you can directly use template driven form approach. Okay, because template driven form is easy to implement and it uses two-way data binding. So the simultaneous update of data model and your data in the model is quite easy in this. Okay. And if you see over here, basically in the template driven form, we use directives. So as I said, anything that you use in a HTML, all these things are called as directives, right? So in your template driven forms, we basically rely on directives, which helps us to kind of so basically what happens is, since it's using directives, so we can directly manipulate the underlying data that we have using the template driven forms. Okay. So just to summarize it, if you just have very basic forms where you have one or two or just a very few minimal amount of input fields which will barely change over the time, and you don't really want to have too much complexities around it, then your template driven form is the best approach for such kind of scenarios. And in this template driven forms, the logic is that your form model is more implicit rather than explicit. What I mean by that is, if you take this form over here, right? So what it means is, if I define a bunch of form elements over here, the form model over here is rather it is more implicit. Means that Angular understands internally what is the data type and what are the things we have to do, rather than we defining it explicitly, this is a form model, this is of this value, this is going to do this, so on and so forth. So that is what we mean by the form model is more implicit here rather than explicit. Okay. And one more thing is, since the template driven form are predominantly driven by the directives which we use for the form creation, the update that happens over here is more asynchronous in nature. What I mean by asynchronous in nature is, if you remember from our synchronous versus asynchronous discussion, so when I update anything over here, though it looks like it's happening in real time, there's actually a lag, meaning our code is getting executed asynchronously. Okay. And one major disadvantage of using template driven form is that unit testing with template driven form is generally very tough. What I mean by unit testing is, say you have to write, if you remember from the previous discussion, any component or any file that we create in Angular also has a corresponding spec.ts file created. So this spec.ts is nothing but where we write the core logic to test our application, right? So if in case say for example, we wrote this pipe which is converting Celsius to Fahrenheit, and in future we want to always ensure that this logic works. So what we can do is, in this spec.ts, we can kind of write the logic over here where we pass it a sample number and we expect whether the converted value is matching that number or not. Okay. Don't worry about unit testing. We'll be covering it in depth in future sessions or the future weeks. But for now, just understand that for your template driven forms, unit testing is generally very hard. Okay. So as a con, what I would say is a few things. One is so before I go to cons, I will take the positives of it. So for the template driven forms, TDF in short. So if the form is very simple, you can go for it. Okay. So there's not much of code and all the things you require to write. Using just two-way data binding and directives, you can quickly write a template driven form easily. So that is very easy to write. So these are the two major advantages of using template driven forms. And on the cons, I would say that the form model is very implicit rather than explicit. So as I said, like, in reactive form template, we explicitly define each and every model and do it, but here it's more of an implicit thing. And due to that, the unit testing becomes tedious. And the data updates, the template driven form is more like asynchronous in nature, because we are using directives. Okay. And if you're using template driven forms, it is very difficult to scale the form in future. Why? Because in template driven form, everything is controlled or directed from the HTML. Okay. So one way to focus, remember this is like your HTML is where the core logic of your form is, and that will then get cascaded to your data in the TypeScript file. Okay. So it is like more from a view, it is directed to the TypeScript file. Okay. So that is the reason it is difficult to scale in future, because you will have a bunch of HTML code already written with all the directives and all the logics, error validation, everything would be in your HTML itself. So in future, say you are now adding 10 new input fields over here. So it is more of a rework and more of tighter binding and all that thing, dependencies you will have, and it is be a tad tough to do it. Okay. Now let's come to the reactive form. So the reactive form is generally suited for most of the applications. So this is also a very I would say a famous interview or a favorite interview question. So the interview may ask you, what do you prefer? Do you prefer template driven form or do you prefer reactive form? Okay. So the answer to that is, the simple answer to that is, if you have a very simple form which is not going to scale in future, it is having very basic and minimal inputs, and you are happy using two-way data binding and directives to achieve it, go for template driven forms. But in the rest of the scenarios where you may have a basic form for now, but it has scope to scale in future, then definitely go for reactive form. And also in this case, even for basic form, you can use reactive form. It's not like, you cannot use reactive form. So always understand this. Any form, you can create it as reactive form and still it will work all right. But if you create any form as template driven form, and if it is going to scale in future, so say for now I have like 10 input in it, and in the future it may scale to 100 input. In this kind of scenario, the template driven form might fail because your unit testing becomes tough. It is asynchronous in nature, so there may be some issues with the data updation and all that thing. So always in most of the scenarios, try to prefer or try to go for reactive forms. Okay, so that is one thing. So why we normally go for reactive form? Let's try to understand that. So in reactive form, what happens is the entire form creation happens in your TypeScript or your component. Okay. The entire how your form is created, how the model is created, how you are going to manipulate it, how you validate the error, how you submit it. So all that logic happens in your TypeScript, and on the HTML, we are just going to kind of just define the HTML structure of it. Okay, so the data flow is more from TypeScript to the HTML. Okay, so that is the first point of reactive form, wherein the entire form model and structure is defined in the component instead of HTML, which happens in the template driven form. This is first thing. The second thing is, since we are going to define everything in the component, it is more explicit in nature. So we have a greater degree of control, and also we know that what we are doing and how it is getting done. Okay. And one more thing is, since you are going to define the entire form control tree in your HTML component, it is synchronous in nature, meaning any update that you do or any changes that happens, it happens quite synchronously, because it kind of gets created like this as a tree fashion. So any update over here automatically cascades down to the entire children of it as well. Okay. So what is the advantage of this is, so say assume you have a form, like say maybe you have a website like say IRCTC or Make My Trip or Go Ibibo, like something of those travel websites, where predominantly the user is going to interact with the application in terms of some form elements, you could give from station to station or from the airport to airport, you will give a date, you will have some class preference, you will give number of passengers, so on and so forth. So if you want to design some such websites where predominantly it is a form driven website, a form driven website is nothing but you have a bunch of inputs and the user is going to enter that, and this form inputs may also change in future. Okay. So say for example, today IRCTC is only doing train, but tomorrow they also decided that, okay, hey, with the train I'm going to give flight and bus as well. So in that kind of scenarios, your form structure might change, your form data might change, and all that thing can happen. But still using reactive form, you will be able to quickly do the change and achieve it quicker, because it is like, since I said you're going to explicitly define the models, and it's going to be synchronous in nature, it's quite easy to update it using the reactive form approach control. Similarly, if your bread and butter is going to depend on this form that you're going to manipulate, it's also important that you always ensure that whatever logic you write over here is working perfectly as per the expected business requirement. So what I mean by that is, let's take a very simple example, IRCTC. I have a from station, I have a to station, I give a date, and maybe I give the class like a sleeper or first class, whatever, and I just say search for train. Okay. So assume that I have a template driven form, wherein as I said earlier, in future it might also be difficult to kind of write unit test cases for that. So assume due to some server issue, or some developer made some mistake, now your form is able to submit without the user entering from a station or a to station, or maybe if the user is entering some invalid data over here, still it is submitting. So this is actually an issue, and potentially might even break your application. So if it is a template driven form, you have to write a really tedious code in order to unit test cases in order to validate the scenario. But in case of reactive forms, since everything is more of a model driven, more of a data driven from TypeScript, it's quite easy to write unit test cases in this kind of scenario. And in case you can also write some failure cases in the test cases to check what happens if I pass some invalid data, whether it is catching it properly, whether I'm getting the error validation properly, and all that thing. So in those kind of scenario, your reactive form approach is a very wise and easy approach to use. So just to sum it up, whenever you have a very large or scalable form driven application, that is a very important word. So go for reactive forms. Okay. And whenever you have a very small, simple, not scalable application, then you go for template driven forms. Okay. So this is to sum it up. And as I said, in reactive forms, what happens is you define everything in your TypeScript, and then it gets cascaded to HTML. In template driven form, everything is on your HTML itself, and then it gets cascaded to TypeScript using the directives and two-way data binding and so on and so forth. So with that, I hope you understood the basics, the basic funda of what is template driven form and reactive forms. So with that being said, I will just take you back to the slide, and we can proceed with the discussion. So next concept is the usage of forms, which we just discussed. So just to summarize it, we say that we use template driven forms only if the form is really simple, it has no scope to scale in future, like adding new inputs and features. And for most other forms, reactive forms are the best of the option by all means, though the code which we may write can be more than that of template driven forms. So another one important concept is template driven forms are easy to write. So if I take a template driven form, it is easy to implement but difficult to maintain. Whereas if I take a reactive form, initially it is, I won't say difficult, but it is a bit difficult to implement, but it is easy to maintain. So this is what the whole concept, right? So that's why we say if your application is not going to scale, not going to grow, then go for TDF, because it is easy to implement. You're just going to implement it one time, and since there is no maintenance involved, this is the best approach. Whereas in reactive form, since you are also going to maintain it and implement it, so these kind of scenarios, it is better that you go for reactive forms. Okay. And as we said, if your bread and butter or your core of the application is totally form driven, by all means, even if it is a simple form, please go for reactive forms, because it is easy for you to validate, it's easy for you to check it, and even in future if you want to add 100 such forms, it's easy for you. I'll also give you one more scenario. So assume we have a scenario wherein you kind of say you are creating a form. So maybe you're creating a form where you are filling about your profile. Okay. So say assume this is something like your employer profile page we are filling. So initially it asks your name, it asks for your name, it asks for your age, it asks for your maybe city of birth, then your address, and then it asks you whether you are married or single. And if you select married, then it shows you a dynamic pop-up where it asks you what is your spouse name, then his or her age, location like city of birth, then the address, where their permanent address, and maybe their cell number. And after that it will ask you, it asks you a pop-up whether do you have kids. Then after that it asks if yes, how many kids, like maybe 1 or 2 or 3, whatever. And depending on that, it shows you a template again, so where it asks you the name of the first son or daughter, then their age, what is the school they are going, and what is their blood group, what is their cell phone number. And similarly, if you selected 2 kids or 3 kids, the same template just gets repeated that many times, right? And if say you want to also give details about your parents or in-laws, so even those will have a similar kind of components which could be repeated that many times. So let's take this example. So if I were to ask you what is the best approach for this, so I hope by now you would have understood that reactive form is better. But let's try to understand why. So as I said, this is a core application where even though it is scalable, even in the runtime, there is a possibility that you will be dynamically showing a lot of input values which were not available earlier. So in this kind of scenario, what happens if we try to implement it using template-driven forms? Even the HTML code that you write for this will be too big, okay? And to maintain it is also a big headache, because in future, say if there is a change in validation, or there's a change in input, or you change the structure itself, you have to almost rewrite the entire code, and there is a lot of hassles involved in maintaining this template driven form. Whereas in reactive form, what happens is we can essentially group all of this into simple groups or form controls and form arrays and all that concept. We will understand all that in the future session. So what happens is you just group it together in certain form arrays, which is nothing but just a section, a group of multiple elements working together. And dynamically, whenever you call one of these to be inserted in the view, you just go and instantiate it and just inject it into the view. So what happens is dynamically this comes into the view, you save it, then that data goes back to the TypeScript, and it gets implemented. And similarly, if you want to write any unit test cases where you want to ensure that if the user is selecting 2 kids, then definitely they should have 2 children input form fields in the HTML. And similarly, if they select they want to enter detail about parents, then they should be able to see the detail for the parent section. If they want in-law, they should be able to see in-law. If they want to enter about their siblings, they should be able to see about sibling. So all these unit test cases writing becomes very easy if you're using the reactive form approach. So with that said, let's go back to the slide. And with this, we have reached to the end of this session. So this week, we learned predominantly about what are pipes and how they help us to transform data which are passed from template expression in HTML. So template expression is nothing but those 2 curly braces within which we write the variable or pass the string or whatever we want. Pipes are executed based on pure change to the input called pure pipes. Pipes that get executed for all Angular change detection cycle are called impure pipes. So if you guys remember, pure pipes works only when there's a change in reference to object. Impure pipe works even if there's a property change, because they just keep on executing for all Angular change detection. We can also define our own custom pipes, as we saw, we defined multiple custom pipes which we saw and we implemented. So custom pipes are nothing but based on the business logic. You can write the transformation logic and they will do the work for you. And finally, we saw what are template driven forms and what are reactive forms and when to use each of them. So just to summarize, template for different forms can be used in scenarios where the form is very simple, it will not scale in the future, and you just want to write it once and there's no much about scope of maintenance. Whereas reactive form is better, where if your core application of the business depends on that form, it is a form driven application, then it is better to go on reactive forms because it is easy to maintain, it is more explicit in nature, and you also can do a lot of unit testing, and it is synchronous in nature as well. And with that said, this is the few reference links which I want you guys to go through for this session. So I've also included a Stack Overflow link over here, which will give you a bit more understanding about what is pure pipe and what is impure pipe. So that's why I've included the second link over here. Go through that and you will understand it better. And I have also included a link on forms overview. So what I'll do is I'll just take you guys quickly to the Angular website right now. So if you just go to Google and type Angular form overview, you will get this first link over here, which is talking about introduction to forms in Angular. So whatever we talked so far, that is what is kind of given over here. So like, if you just go over here, it will say that, you have two approach, one is reactive and one is template. Then it will tell you what are the structure of it, like what is the difference of it. So data flow, as we discussed, is synchronous in reactive or synchronous in template. Form validation is function. Here it is predominantly directive. Why it is function? Because everything is written in TypeScript, so it is function, because we write the functions in TypeScript. And why directives here? Because we are using most of the built-in template driven form directives. That's why the form validation is happening over directives over here. And the data model is more structured and immutable, whereas here it is unstructured and mutable. It is more implicit, created by directives. It is more explicit, created in component class, scalability and all that thing. And once you think you are like, just go through this entire example once. It's not required that you need to understand every part of it, but just kind of go through it, understand like how the data flows between a template driven form and how the data flows between a reactive form. So just to explain you guys quickly. So if you take a reactive form, what happens is when you type something in the input, it fires an event, and in your form control instance, you'll be having a kind of a function which will be like, manipulating that value for you, right? And what happens in case of a template driven form is, there will be a directive over here in this input itself, which will be like, catch that firing event, and then it will be manipulating the data for you. So just go through all these things in your free time, and just try to understand the concepts. In the next week, that is the week 9, we'll be talking fully about what is template driven form. We'll be creating a template driven form from the scratch, and we'll be seeing the various features of it. And in the week 10, we will be focusing purely on what is reactive form. Similarly, what we did to template form, we'll be doing it for the reactive form as well. And we will be understanding it in a bit in detail. So like, we'll understand how to create forms, how to validate forms, like how to group the forms, what are the other things that we can do with the forms, how to submit it, how to reset it, like we'll try all that kind of things. So yeah, so that is the part about these references. Go through it and go through all these links and just get your concept clear. And with that, we have reached to end of this session and week. Thank you for your time, and looking forward to see you in the next week. Bye.